The air was still the night I first matched with him. I was sitting alone in my living room, scrolling through ourtime.com with the cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd find someone who understood me. The app felt like a safe harbor for someone like me, past the chaos of my 20s, ready for connection, tired of games. When his profile popped up, I couldn't help but pause. His name was David. His photo radiated warmth, silver-streaked hair, a clean-cut beard, a charmingly crooked smile. He looked distinguished, confident, and safe. But it was his words that pulled me in. His first message was simple: "Your smile is beautiful." It brightened my day. I laughed at the cliché, but I couldn't deny how good it felt to be noticed. David said he lived in Flagstaff, Arizona, just an hour and a half from me. That proximity felt like fate. "We could meet for coffee sometime," I said, feeling bold. But David was always traveling for business. "Soon," he promised. "You're worth the wait." Over the next week, we spent hours talking every day. It felt like a whirlwind, a romance straight out of a Hallmark movie. He asked about my favorite books, my childhood dreams, even the little things like how I took my coffee. He said he loved how I saw the world, how my laughter made his day better, even through a phone call. He seemed to know exactly what I wanted to hear, and maybe that should have been my first red flag. But I wasn't thinking about red flags. I was thinking about how he made me feel seen, special, alive. By the second week, David was calling me his soulmate. "It's crazy," he'd say, his voice low and tender. "I've met thousands of people in my life, but I've never connected with anyone the way I connect with you." By the fourth week, he started talking about marriage. It felt sudden, but the intensity of it was intoxicating. "We'd have the most amazing life together," he told me one night. I could picture it. Cozy evenings in Flagstaff, long drives through Sedona, maybe even a cabin in the woods where we could escape the world. David had a way of painting a future that made it hard to question the present. But there were questions, ones I couldn't ignore. Why hadn't we met in person yet? Why was he always traveling, always just out of reach? I brought it up once, lightly, but he brushed it off with a laugh. "Trust me," he said, "I'm worth the wait." Still, doubts crept in, and late at night, I'd lie in bed Googling everything he told me. His job, the places he said he'd been, even the company he claimed to work for. To my relief, it all seemed to check out. Every piece of his story aligned just enough with the truth to quiet my fears. Until the morning of the email. It was a Monday, and I remember waking up to the ping of a new message on my phone. David's name flashed across the screen. Smiling, I opened it, expecting another love-soaked note about how much he missed me. But the subject line hit me like a slap: urgent, need your help. The message was long, rambling, desperate. He explained that he was stuck overseas, his bank accounts frozen due to some convoluted mix-up with local authorities. "I didn't want to burden you with this," he wrote, "but you're the only person I can trust." He needed $8,000. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. This wasn't the David I thought I knew. This was a stranger, and suddenly, the charming words and heartfelt promises didn't feel so real. My first instinct was anger. How dare he? But as I read the email again, I noticed the manipulation woven into his words. "You're the only person I can turn to," he pleaded. "If you love me, if you believe in us, please help me. I promise I'll pay you back. I just need to get home to you." I typed back a short, firm response: "No, I can't help you." Minutes later, my phone buzzed with his call. I answered, half expecting him to apologize, to admit it was all some mistake. Instead, his voice cracked with tears. "You don't understand," he sobbed. "I'm sick. I haven't eaten in days. I just want to come home to you." My chest tightened. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe the man I'd spent hours talking to wasn't a liar. But something deep inside me, the part of me that had ignored the little red flags for weeks, knew better. "David, I can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't stop. For the next few days, he called and messaged constantly, his pleas escalating. "Do you want me to die here?" he asked once. Another time, his tone turned cold, accusing me of abandoning him. "I thought you loved me," he spat. I guess I was wrong. By the second week, I felt like I was living in a nightmare. The man who once made me feel special now made me feel trapped, suffocated. I blocked his number, but the emails kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. My heart ached, but not for him. It ached for the version of him I thought was real, for the love I'd let myself believe in. Finally, I sent him one last message: "This is over. Don't contact me again." And then silence. For weeks, I carried a heavy shame. How could I have been so naive? I replayed every conversation, every moment, searching for the cracks I should have seen. But the truth is, David, or whoever he really was, knew exactly how to weave a story that felt just real enough to believe. He knew how to make me feel safe, cherished, loved. And that's what makes people like him so dangerous. Looking back now, I see it clearly, the love bombing, the constant excuses, the way he isolated me emotionally while keeping me tethered to him. It wasn't love. It was a scam. And I wasn't the first woman he'd targeted. I likely wasn't the last. It's been over a year since David disappeared from my life, and I'm still healing. I'm more cautious now, more skeptical of words that sound too perfect. But I haven't given up on the idea of love. I've learned that the people who truly care about you don't rush you, don't pressure you, and they certainly don't ask for $8,000. Sometimes I wonder if David thinks about me, if he ever regrets what he did. But then I remind myself, I was never a person to him. I was a mark, and now I'm a survivor. The night started like any other in my wild phase. My friends and I called it our no strings, no stress era, a time for hookups and carefree nights where swiping right on Tinder was more of a game than a genuine search for connection. It was thrilling, like rolling dice in a game where you didn't care about the outcome. That's how I met him. Let's call him Kyle. Kyle and I matched one Thursday evening. His profile was unremarkable, floppy brown hair, a decent smile, and a bio that read, "If you don't like dogs, we can't be friends." I wasn't looking for Prince Charming, so I swiped right. A few messages later, we had plans to meet for bingo night at a popular bar in our college town. It wasn't romantic, but it was public, and the beer was cheap. What did I have to lose? The bar was packed when I arrived. Neon lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of fried food and spilled drinks filled the air. Kyle was already there, sitting at a sticky table with 2 bingo cards and a pitcher of beer. He looked better in person, taller, broader, with an easy grin that hinted he was used to talking his way out of trouble. The night started well enough. We played a few rounds of bingo, laughed at the rowdy regulars, and shared a plate of soggy nachos. Kyle wasn't the most riveting conversationalist, but he was funny in a try-hard sort of way, cracking jokes that made me laugh despite myself. He was charming enough to convince me to invite him back to my place. That's when things took a turn. When we got back to my apartment, the vibe shifted. What started as flirty banter fizzled into awkward silence. Kyle seemed nervous, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt and glancing around like he was casing the place. I tried to lighten the mood, but it was clear the chemistry had evaporated somewhere between the bar and my front door. Still, I figured we'd chalk it up to a bad night, and he'd leave by morning. But Kyle had other plans. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my roommates in the kitchen and the sinking realization that Kyle was still there. He was sprawled on my couch, scrolling through his phone like he had no intention of leaving. I tried to be polite. "Hey, do you need a ride or something?" I asked, hoping he'd get the hint. Instead, he looked up and smiled. "Nah, I'm good," he said, completely oblivious, or worse, pretending to be. I wasn't good. My roommates weren't good. My best friend, who was flipping pancakes in the kitchen, shot me a look that said, "Why is this guy still here?" I mouthed back, "I don't know." The tension built as the minutes ticked by. Kyle showed no signs of moving. He even had the audacity to ask for coffee. I made a pot, handed him a mug, and hoped he'd take the caffeine and run. No luck. Finally, my best friend decided enough was enough. She grabbed a plate of pancakes, the rejects, the ones that were burned or misshapen, and stormed into the living room. "Kyle," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel, "you need to leave." "Now." Kyle blinked at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. "What? Why?" Without missing a beat, she started hurling pancakes at him. One hit him square in the chest. Another landed in his lap. "Get out," she shouted, punctuating each word with a flying pancake. Kyle scrambled to his feet, holding his hands up in mock surrender. Okay, I'm leaving," he stammered, dodging another pancake as he grabbed his shoes and bolted for the door. The moment he was gone, the room erupted in laughter. I was mortified, but also ridiculously grateful. "Remind me to never invite a Tinder date over again," I said, collapsing onto the couch. Fast forward 2 months, and despite my vow to swear off Tinder, I found myself swiping again. That's when I matched with someone completely different. Let's call him James. James's profile stood out immediately. His pictures weren't overly curated, just him hiking, playing guitar, and smiling like he actually enjoyed life. His bio was simple but thoughtful, Southern guy in a big city. Love live music, long conversations, and good barbecue. Something about him felt genuine, so I swiped right. We started talking, and within minutes, it was clear he wasn't like Kyle, or anyone else I'd met on Tinder. James was thoughtful, funny, and kind in a way that didn't feel forced. After a few days of chatting, he asked me out for coffee, and I couldn't say yes fast enough. Our first date lasted 6 hours. We sat in a little cafe, talking about everything from childhood memories to our dream travel destinations. He told me about growing up in the South, how his mom made the best peach cobbler, and how he'd moved to the city for school but stayed for the music scene. I told him about my wild phase, leaving out the pancake incident, and how I was starting to want something more real. By the time the cafe closed, I knew I wanted to see him again. But then disaster struck. A few days after our first date, I dropped my phone in a pool. When I finally got a replacement, I logged back into Tinder only to find a message from James. Guess you weren't interested after all. Take care. My stomach sank. I immediately messaged him back, explaining what had happened and praying he'd give me another chance. To my relief, he did. On our second date, we went for a walk in the park and talked for hours again. By the third date, I couldn't resist anymore. Are you ever going to kiss me? I asked, half joking but mostly serious. James turned bright red, stammering. I didn't want to be disrespectful. I laughed and leaned in. Don't worry. I'm giving you permission. That kiss sealed the deal. James was everything I didn't know I was looking for, gentle, thoughtful, and so incredibly kind. We've been together ever since, and every day I'm grateful I re-downloaded Tinder to talk to him again. Sometimes we joke about our origin story. I'll tease him for thinking I ghosted him, and he'll ask about the pancake guy I dated before him. And though I cringe every time I think about Kyle and his overstayed welcome, I can't help but laugh. After all, if it weren't for that chaotic phase, I might not have found James, the guy who turned a hookup app into the start of something real. There's a moment, late at night, when loneliness feels like a weight pressing down on your chest. You lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if there's something fundamentally unlovable about you. That's where I was when I downloaded the dating app. My friends had been nudging me toward it for months. You're amazing, they'd say. You just need to put yourself out there. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that someone out there would see me for who I was, strong, funny, compassionate, and not just the wheelchair. It started well enough. The swiping, the messages, it was a distraction at first. The guys I matched with were nice, charming even. They complimented my smile or told me how cool it was that I loved hiking. Yes, I still hike. Thank you very much. At first, I felt like I was just another girl looking for love. But it didn't take long for reality to set in. It always began the same way. Polite messages, playful banter, a hint of chemistry. Then the inevitable questions would come. Some were harmless. So what happened? Or have you always been in a wheelchair? Others weren't. One guy straight up asked, "Can you even have sex?" Another joked, "I bet you get great parking though." I forced myself to laugh it off, but inside I felt gutted. Still I pressed on. I knew I couldn't control other people's ignorance, but I held on to hope that someone, somewhere, would be different. I matched with a guy named Liam one night. His profile was simple. A picture of him hiking, another of him laughing with friends, and a bio that read, "Looking for someone to share adventures and tacos with." He seemed easygoing, so I swiped right. To my surprise, he messaged me almost immediately. "You have the kindest eyes," he wrote. "How's your night going?" Our conversation flowed effortlessly. Liam didn't ask invasive questions, didn't make weird jokes. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about me, my favorite movies, the best concert I'd ever been to, how I managed to make cheesecake from scratch without burning the kitchen down, long story. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen. After a few days of messaging, Liam asked me out. "There's this great little Italian place downtown," he said. "Let me take you." I hesitated. By then, I'd been ghosted so many times I'd stopped counting. Some guys would talk to me for weeks, only to disappear the moment I brought up meeting in person. But Liam seemed different. He knew I used a wheelchair. I'd made sure of that, and he didn't flinch. "I promise," he said, "I won't waste your time." So I said yes. The date was perfect. Liam was sweet, funny, attentive. He held the door open for me without making a big deal of it, didn't awkwardly hover when I transferred into my seat, and didn't bombard me with questions about my disability. Instead, we talked about everything else. Our favorite books, our bucket lists, the worst karaoke performances we'd ever witnessed. By the end of the night, I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself hope. We started seeing each other regularly after that. For months, Liam was everything I thought I'd been searching for. He'd text me good morning, plan thoughtful dates, even call just to hear my voice. It felt like a dream, a rare, precious thing I didn't want to let go of. But then slowly, cracks began to show. It started with small things. Liam would cancel plans last minute or take hours to respond to texts. When we were together, he seemed distracted, distant. At first, I thought it was work stress or something unrelated. I gave him space, tried to be understanding. But deep down, a gnawing feeling began to grow. One night, after weeks of his half-hearted excuses, I confronted him. "Liam," I said, my voice trembling, "what's going on? Did I do something wrong?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's not you," he said after a long pause. I don't know if I can do this." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Do what?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely at my chair. I thought I was okay with it, but I don't know. It's a lot. It's a lot. The phrase echoed in my head, cold and hollow. I wanted to scream, to tell him how much of myself I'd held back, how hard I'd worked to protect my heart from exactly this. But all I could do was nod. "Thanks for being honest," I said, my voice flat. I wish I could say that was the last time something like that happened, but it wasn't. Over and over, I ran into the same walls. Men who couldn't look past the chair, who saw my disability as a burden or an obstacle or something to be pitted. Some ghosted me outright. Others stuck around long enough to convince themselves they were good guys before disappearing. Every time, it chipped away at me a little more. And then there were the ones who stayed for the wrong reasons. The ones who fetishized my disability, who made crude jokes or treated me like a conquest. One guy even had the audacity to tell me he was curious what sex with me would be like. I blocked him immediately, but his words lingered, a reminder of the narrow, dehumanizing box some people tried to shove me into. Through it all, I learned to read between the lines. I could tell who was talking to me for the right reasons by the way the conversation flowed, or didn't. Some men were respectful, genuinely curious about me as a person. Others weren't. The difference was obvious, but it didn't make the process any less exhausting. I'd like to say that I eventually found someone who proved me wrong, who saw me for everything I was and not just the chair. Maybe one day I will. But for now, I'm learning to love myself in a world that often tries to diminish me. I'm learning to set boundaries, to demand respect, to call out ignorance when I see it. Dating isn't easy for anyone, but for people like me, it's a battlefield. Every interaction feels like a test. Will they see me for who I am, or will they let their assumptions get in the way? It's a question I'm tired of asking, but one I refuse to stop seeking the answer to. Because I deserve love. We all do. And one day I'll find it on my terms. I should have trusted my gut. The moment he texted me saying he couldn't meet me at the pier because his license was revoked, a warning bell rang in my head. But against my better judgment, I brushed it off. Maybe he just fell on hard times, I told myself. No big deal. After all, we'd been texting for weeks, and he seemed normal, funny, a little flirty, and laid back in a way that felt refreshing. I'd already made the drive, so what was the harm in meeting him halfway? I agreed to meet him at a pizza place closer to where he lived, and that was my first mistake. When I got there, I waited outside, scrolling my phone and glancing at every guy who walked past. I didn't spot him at first, probably because the person walking toward me didn't look much like the guy from the dating app. His profile photos showed someone clean-cut, with neatly styled hair and a confident, easy smile. The man approaching me was rough. His greasy hair clung to his forehead, and his shirt had holes big enough to pass as ventilation. The closer he got, the more it hit me. This was him. I should have left then and there. But instead, I gave him an awkward side hug, praying it was just an off day. "Hey," I said, trying to mask my unease. "Should we grab a seat inside?" He shook his head, grinning like we were in on some private joke. "Oh no, we're not getting pizza," he said. "Let's go to the park instead." Another warning bell. Who suggests a park over pizza? But I was already here, and politeness, my greatest flaw, kept me rooted in place. Okay, I said, forcing a smile. "Lead the way." As we walked, I started noticing things I hadn't picked up before. His gums were stained black, and his tongue ring clicked ominously against his teeth when he talked. He smelled faintly of cigarettes and something else, something sour. I tried to keep the conversation going, but he mostly mumbled one-word answers, his eyes darting around like he was already bored. When we got to the park, I spotted a bench and gestured toward it. "Let's sit here," I said, relieved to have a plan that didn't involve wandering aimlessly. But before I could sit, he grabbed me by the waist and pulled me onto his lap. "God, baby girl, you are so cute," he said, squeezing me like I was some kind of stress ball. Every muscle in my body locked up. I managed to slide off his lap, muttering something about being more comfortable on the bench. I was hoping he'd take the hint, but he just leaned closer, his eyes glued to me like I was a buffet he couldn't wait to devour. Desperate to steer the conversation somewhere safe, I asked him about his favorite places to eat. He didn't even pretend to listen. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started texting, nodding absently as I spoke. After a few minutes, he interrupted me mid-sentence. "Hey, have you smoked?" he asked, his tone suddenly animated. "My friend's a plug. We could go back to my place for a bowl." "No thanks," I said quickly, shaking my head. The last thing I wanted was to be alone with this guy anywhere near his friend. "Ah, come on, baby girl," he cooed, leaning closer. "My place is just right there. We could have some fun, too." I forced a laugh, praying it masked the rising panic in my chest. "I'm good," I said firmly, scooting a little farther down the bench. "Thanks, though." That's when it happened. Without warning, he reached for my face, cupping my cheeks in his hands. His breath smelled like stale cigarettes and cheap beer as he leaned in and whispered, "You're so innocent." Before I could even process what he was doing, he pressed his broad, wet tongue against my chin and dragged it all the way up to my ear. I froze. For a moment, I just sat there stunned, trying to convince myself that what had just happened wasn't real. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe my brain had short-circuited from sheer awkwardness. But no, there he was, grinning like he'd just paid me the highest compliment in the world. I needed an exit, and I needed it fast. Grabbing my phone, I pretended it was buzzing. "Oh no," I said, my voice shaky. "It's my roommate. She needs me to come back, like, right now." He frowned, his expression shifting from confusion to annoyance. "What? Already?" "Yeah, sorry," I said, standing up and taking a step back. "It's kind of an emergency." He stared at me for a long moment, his black-stained gums showing as he chewed on the inside of his cheek. "Fine," he said, finally shrugging. "Text me later." "Sure," I lied, already turning toward the parking lot. As soon as I was out of sight, I practically sprinted to my car. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The whole drive home, I replayed the night in my head, kicking myself for not leaving the moment I realized he wasn't who he'd claimed to be. By the time I got home, I was furious. At him, at myself, at the universe for putting me in that situation. I deleted the app that night, swearing off online dating for good. But even now, every once in a while, I'll find myself thinking about that wet, slimy tongue on my face and shuddering all over again. The lesson? Trust your gut. If the warning bells start ringing, listen. Because sometimes the guy on the other end of the app isn't just a bad date. He's a full-blown horror story waiting to happen. Some people call it a red flag. I called it curiosity. That's the only way I can explain why I kept going after the tattoo. If you've ever had one of those moments where your gut screams stop and your brain goes, but what if? That was me. I matched with a girl on a dating app, and by the end of this story, you'll wonder how I lived to tell it. Trust me, I do too. We started like any other match. A flurry of messages that night, her wit keeping pace with mine, and a phone call that stretched way longer than I intended. She was funny, quick, and seemed genuinely interested in me. Toward the end of the call, I asked if she wanted to meet up the next night. She said yes, and for a moment, I felt a rare excitement, like maybe this wouldn't be just another forgettable app date. 5 minutes later, she texted, "I need to tell you something." I read it and immediately braced for some curveball. An ex, a weird hobby, a secret marriage. What she said, though, caught me completely off guard. I'm in a wheelchair permanently. I hope that's okay. My stomach twisted. Not because of the wheelchair itself, but because of the suddenness. What was the right move here? Back out and risk being a jerk? Or go through with it and hope I wasn't getting in over my head? After a minute of pacing, I texted back, "Why not? It's just a date. Let's see where it goes." We talked more that night, and things were fine, actually more than fine. She was charming, the kind of person who could talk you into anything without you realizing it. So when she called me the next morning, bright and early, I didn't think twice about picking up. She sounded excited. "I'm doing something crazy," she teased. "What kind of crazy?" I asked. "You'll see," she said, laughing. "I'll send you a picture later." I didn't push for details. A few hours went by, and then my phone buzzed. "Check your messages," she texted. So I did. It was a picture of her wrist, and on it, in black ink, was my name. At first, I thought it was a joke. Maybe she drew it on with a Sharpie. But no, the edges were red and swollen. It was fresh. My name, permanently etched into her skin, after one night of texting and a phone call. My brain short-circuited. What was I supposed to say? Cool tattoo? What the hell were you thinking? I ended the call quickly, telling her I'd see her later. Then I immediately told my friends. "Dude," one of them said, "you're going to meet her after this?" "She's nuts." "Yeah, but now I have to," I said. "I need to know if it's real." That night, I got in my car and drove toward her place. On the way, it hit me. What if my car doesn't accommodate her wheelchair? She mentioned she could drive, so I texted her to ask if she'd take the wheel instead. She agreed, and by the time I pulled into her parking lot, she was waiting in her car. I climbed in, expecting some kind of accessible vehicle with hand controls. Instead, I saw her crutches. One crutch for the gas, one crutch for the brake. That was her system. My heart dropped. We were in Southern California, about to hit the freeway in rush hour traffic, and this woman was treating her crutches like a DIY driving kit. "Do you always drive like this?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh yeah, it's fine," she said, laughing. "I've been doing it for years." It didn't feel fine. Not as she tapped the gas crutch, and we lurched onto the freeway. I gripped the door handle, mentally preparing for the worst. But somehow, we made it to the restaurant. Dinner was fine. She was a little more intense in person, but I chalked it up to nerves. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and sighed. "It's my daughter," she said. "Wait, you have a kid?" I asked, surprised. "Yeah, she's 10. She's home alone, but it's okay." I gave her something to help her sleep. My jaw dropped. "Do you need to go back?" I asked. "We can end the date early." No, she said, waving me off. "She's fine. She'll fall asleep soon." I tried to keep eating, but my appetite was gone. Who leaves a 10-year-old alone at night? More importantly, who drugs them to make it easier? I wanted to call it quits then, but I'd already promised to take her to a movie. When we got back in the car, she looked over at me and grinned. "You know," she said, "I'm kinda drunk." My blood ran cold. "Drunk?" I asked. "You only had one drink." She shrugged, tapping the gas crutch. "Guess I'm a lightweight." I tried to keep calm. "Do you want me to drive?" I offered. "I don't mind." "Nah," she said, laughing. "We're good. I'm just gonna hop in the fast lane." And she did. She leaned the crutch into the gas pedal, accelerating as we merged into speeding traffic. I said a quick prayer and clutched the seatbelt, fully convinced I wouldn't make it out alive. Somehow, we made it back to her place. As I helped her to her door, she turned and looked at me with a grin. "This was fun," she said. "Let's do it again." I nodded, too stunned to speak. As soon as she was inside, I bolted back to my car and sat there for a moment, just breathing. The tattoo had been real. Everything else had been real. That was the last time I saw her. I blocked her number, deleted the app, and spent the next few days thanking every higher power I could think of that I survived. Dating is already risky enough, but this was something else entirely. The first time I met him, he seemed harmless. We'd matched on Hinge a few weeks prior, exchanging light messages about our favorite TV shows and the best coffee shops in town. He was charming in his texts, funny, polite, and attentive in a way that felt refreshing. When he suggested meeting in person, I hesitated. He didn't want to meet at a bar or restaurant like most people. Instead, he asked to meet at a park. "It's more casual," he said. "Just a chance to talk without distractions." Something about it felt off, but I brushed it aside. Maybe he just wasn't into the typical date scene. I told myself I was overthinking it and agreed. When I arrived at the park, he was already there, sitting on a bench with a book in his lap. He smiled and stood up to greet me, and I immediately felt a sense of relief. He seemed normal. Kind eyes, neatly dressed, a little nervous but in a sweet way. As we walked, he told me he'd just moved to the city and was crashing with his cousin while he got settled. It explained why he wasn't eager to meet at his place or anywhere too formal. By the end of the date, I found myself thinking this could work. But then things started to shift. After our meeting, he became relentless. He texted constantly, sent good morning and good night messages like we were already in a relationship, and started calling me pet names: babe, sweetheart, my girl. At first, I thought it was sweet, if a little fast. But as the days went on, his messages became more intense. "I just know you're the one," he said once. I've never felt this way about anyone before. It was flattering, sure, but also unsettling. We'd only met once. How could he possibly know that? I tried to slow things down, responding to his messages less frequently, and keeping our conversations light. But he didn't take the hint. He kept pushing, saying things like, "I can't wait to hold you again, and you feel like home to me." Against my better judgment, I let him come over. He'd been so persistent, so insistent that we were meant to be, that I finally caved, telling myself it would be easier to see him in person and gauge if I was overreacting. Maybe he was just an intense guy, and I was letting my guard get the better of me. The moment he walked through my door, though, I knew I'd made a mistake. He acted like we were already in a relationship, walking in without hesitation, kicking off his shoes, and sprawling on my couch like he'd been there 100 times before. "So cozy," he said, looking around with a smile. "I could get used to this." I laughed nervously, trying to mask my discomfort. "Can I get you something to drink?" "No, babe, I'm good," he said, patting the couch beside him. "Come sit with me." The way he called me babe made my skin crawl. I sat down, keeping a noticeable distance between us, but he immediately slid closer, draping an arm over my shoulders like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "I knew it the second I saw you." I tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground, asking about his new job, how he liked the city so far, but he wasn't interested in talking. He kept cutting me off, leaning in too close, making comments that felt way too intimate for someone I'd just met. "You're everything I've ever wanted," he said at one point, his hand brushing against my leg. I don't know how I got so lucky. Every alarm bell in my head was ringing. I felt trapped, stuck in my own apartment with a stranger who seemed oblivious to how uncomfortable he was making me. I tried to play it cool, smiling and nodding while desperately thinking of an excuse to get him to leave. Then, he said something that froze me in place. "I think I'll move in here," he said casually, like he was suggesting we order takeout. "I mean, your place is so much nicer than my cousin's. And we're so great together. It just makes sense, doesn't it?" I laughed, thinking it had to be a joke, but his expression didn't change. He was completely serious. That's not really how this works," I said, forcing a smile. "We just met, but we're perfect for each other," he insisted, his tone shifting from sweet to slightly defensive. "Why waste time pretending we're not? You know it too. I can see it in your eyes." I stood up, pretending to check my phone. "Oh wow, it's getting late," I said. "I actually have an early morning tomorrow, so..." He didn't move. He just sat there, staring up at me like he was trying to read my mind. For a moment, I thought he might refuse to leave. Then he sighed, stood up, and grabbed his shoes. "All right," he said, "but I'm coming back tomorrow." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, like it wasn't even a question, sent a shiver down my spine. As soon as he walked out the door, I locked it and sank onto the couch, my heart racing. I replayed the night in my head, trying to make sense of it. How had things gone from normal to terrifying so quickly? Was I overreacting, or was there something genuinely wrong with this guy? The next morning, the text started again. "I miss you," he wrote. "Can't wait to see you later." I didn't respond. By the end of the day, he'd sent a dozen more messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Why aren't you answering me? Did I do something wrong? I'm coming over." That last message made my blood run cold. I blocked his number immediately, but for weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might show up unannounced. Every time I walked into my apartment, I checked the locks. Every time I heard a knock at the door, my heart jumped. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts the moment he asked to meet in a park. There were so many red flags I ignored, so many moments I told myself to give him the benefit of the doubt. But now I know better. Sometimes being polite isn't worth the risk. Sometimes it's better to walk away before the stranger at the park becomes the nightmare in your home. Some people say love hits you when you least expect it. That's what I thought the day I matched with him. Let's call him Jason. He wasn't just attractive, he was magnetic, the kind of guy whose profile made you stop mid-swipe. His messages were thoughtful, his humor sharp, and the way he talked made me feel like the only woman in the world. By the end of our first conversation, I was hooked. It felt like we'd known each other forever. We moved fast, too fast. Over the course of a week, Jason and I built an emotional connection that felt unshakable. Every text, every call, every late-night confession made me believe I'd finally found someone who truly understood me. When we met in person, it was even better. He was charming, attentive, and made me laugh until my stomach hurt. I couldn't believe my luck. But then, he dropped the first bombshell. One night, just a week into talking, Jason brought up the idea of moving to Florida. "I'm thinking about starting fresh," he said, his voice low and serious. "A new city, a new life. Come with me." I laughed, thinking he was joking. "We've only just met," I said. "I know," he replied, his tone unshakably earnest. "But I've never felt this way before. You're the one, and I don't want to waste time." His words should have set off alarms, but I was too caught up in the whirlwind of it all. I politely declined, explaining that it was way too soon to even consider something like that. He seemed disappointed, but said he understood. Then, just as I was starting to relax, he added, "You know what? Forget it. I won't go. I'll stay here. For you." It felt more unsettling than romantic. Red flag number one. But I brushed it off, convincing myself that maybe he was just impulsive. We kept talking, and for a while things went back to being perfect, or so I thought. Then came the drunken phone calls. It started with one late-night call out of the blue. Jason's voice was slurred, his words tumbling out in a drunken haze. "You're too good for me," he said, his tone a strange mix of admiration and despair. "I don't deserve you. You should be with someone better." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. "What are you talking about? We're great together." He didn't answer. Instead, he mumbled something about being messed up and ended the call abruptly. It left me confused and uneasy, but I chalked it up to him having a bad night. Everyone has their moments, right? But it wasn't just one bad night. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming, each one more erratic than the last. He'd drunk dial me at odd hours, repeating the same refrain. I was too good for him. He didn't deserve me. He was no good. Each time, I pressed him to explain what he meant, but he dodged the question, saying things like, "You wouldn't understand," or "It's better if you don't know." I started to worry. This wasn't the guy I thought I knew, the guy who'd been so confident and put together when we first met. It felt like there was a storm brewing just beneath the surface, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Finally, one night, I had enough. He called again, his voice thick with alcohol, and launched into his usual self-deprecating monologue. "I'm bad for you," he said. "You should hate me. You'll hate me when you know the truth." "Then tell me." I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "What's going on, Jason? What aren't you telling me?" For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, hear the tension in the air. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that changed everything. "I'm selling heroin." I froze. "What?" I said, thinking I must have misheard. "I sell heroin," he repeated, his voice steady now. "I've been doing it for a while. I don't know how to get out. It's who I am." It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The man I'd been falling for, the man who'd seemed so perfect, was a drug dealer. My mind raced, trying to piece it all together. The impulsive behavior, the self-loathing, the constant drinking. It all made sense now, but it didn't make it any less horrifying. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because I didn't want to lose you," he said simply. "But now you know, and you'll leave. Everyone always does." He was right. I couldn't stay. I told him I needed time to think and ended the call. But the second I hung up, I knew there was no going back. This wasn't just a red flag, it was a neon sign screaming danger. I couldn't be a part of his world, couldn't tether myself to someone so deep in something so destructive. The next morning I texted him, "I can't do this. Please don't contact me again." He called me repeatedly after that, leaving voicemails, begging me to reconsider, promising he'd change. But I knew better. I blocked his number, deleted his messages, and tried to move on. For weeks, I lived in a state of paranoia, half expecting him to show up at my door, to drag me into his chaos. In the end, I learned a hard truth. You can't always trust what you see on the surface. People can seem perfect, can sweep you off your feet, and make you believe in fairy tales. But sometimes, they're hiding the kind of darkness you can't save them from. Jason wasn't just a bad date or a mistake. He was a wake-up call, a reminder to trust my instincts and listen to the little voice that says, something isn't right. Because sometimes that voice is the only thing standing between you and disaster. It started off like any other date. My daughter was excited, nervous, but in that giddy way you get before meeting someone new. She'd met him on Bumble, and from what she'd told me, he seemed like a great guy. Polite, funny, good-looking, and a little adventurous. The kind of guy who knew how to charm through a screen. When she walked out the door that evening, I could tell she had high hopes. But by the time she came back, her face told a very different story. "Mom, you won't believe the disaster I just endured," she said, kicking off her shoes and slumping onto the couch. Her voice was a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. "It started out fine. Really, it did. The date had begun at a cozy little restaurant downtown, one of those places with candlelit tables and soft jazz playing in the background. They had clicked during the first hour, laughing about bad movies, bonding over their shared love of dogs, and swapping travel stories. When he ordered dessert for both of them without asking, she even thought it was sweet. "He seemed so confident," she said, shaking her head. "I actually thought this guy might be different." Then the dessert arrived, and with it, the unraveling of the evening. The conversation shifted abruptly when he started talking about his ex. At first, it was just a passing mention, an anecdote about how she hated chocolate mousse. But then the floodgates opened, and my daughter found herself sitting across from a man who was spiraling fast. "It went from 0 to 100 so quickly," she said. "One second, he was telling me she didn't like mousse, and the next, he was ranting about what a horrible person she was. He described, in excruciating detail, how she'd been manipulative, cold, and selfish. How she'd crushed his spirit and made him question everything about himself. His voice got louder, his gestures more animated, until he was practically ranting to the entire restaurant. My daughter tried to steer the conversation back to safer territory, but he was like a freight train with no brakes. I didn't know what to do, she told me. I just sat there nodding, hoping he'd run out of steam. But he didn't. Instead, he started crying. He was full-on sobbing, Mom. Like tears streaming down his face, nose running, the whole thing. The other diners began to notice, casting uncomfortable glances in their direction. My daughter didn't know whether to console him or crawl under the table in embarrassment. She reached for a napkin and handed it to him, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said. "How long were you two together?" That's when the real kicker came. He sniffled, wiped his nose, and said, 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Mom, my daughter repeated, her voice climbing an octave. I couldn't believe it. He was acting like he'd lost the love of his life, and they hadn't even been together for a month. She stared at him, speechless, unsure how to respond. But then, just as quickly as the tears had started, they stopped. He straightened up in his chair, cleared his throat, and gave her a sheepish smile. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought the date might recover. Maybe he'd laugh it off, apologize, and they could salvage the rest of the evening. Instead, he leaned forward and said, "So, do you think we could still, sleep together? Like for sympathy?" My daughter blinked, certain she must have misheard him. "What?" she asked, her voice sharp. He said, as if he were suggesting something completely normal. "You're really pretty, and I've had a rough time lately. I think it would really help me feel better." She stared at him, dumbfounded. The audacity of it left her momentarily speechless. Here was a man who had just spent the better part of an hour ranting, crying, and unloading emotional baggage from a 3-week relationship. And now he was asking for a pity hookup? "No," she said firmly, grabbing her bag and standing up. "Absolutely not." He looked genuinely surprised, like he couldn't fathom why she wouldn't be on board with his suggestion. "Why not?" he asked, his tone almost offended. "We've already had a great time tonight." "Because this is insane," she said, throwing down cash for her half of the bill. "And you need therapy, not a date." She walked out of the restaurant, her heart pounding, and didn't look back. He texted her a few times afterward, apologizing for being too emotional and asking for another chance. She didn't respond. When she finished telling me the story, we both sat in stunned silence for a moment before bursting into laughter. It was the kind of laughter that comes from pure disbelief, the only way to process something so absurd. "I'm proud of you," I said finally, "for walking away. A lot of people would have caved out of politeness." She shrugged. "Honestly, I'm just glad I didn't order the mousse." To this day, that story is a running joke in our family. Anytime one of us is having a rough time, we'll jokingly ask, "Think we could sleep together? For sympathy?" It's become shorthand for dodging a bullet and trusting your instincts when someone's red flags start waving like a parade. Because if there's one thing my daughter learned that night, it's this. Sometimes the best thing you can do on a bad date is walk away. And sometimes the best thing you can do afterward is laugh. Because what else can you do when faced with that level of absurdity? The truth about online dating? You never really know who you're meeting until it's too late. It's like rolling the dice. Sometimes you win, and sometimes you end up questioning all of your life choices in the back of an Uber. This was the latter. It started innocently enough. I matched with this guy on Tinder, and he seemed like the whole package. His bio said he was an accountant working downtown, loved dogs, and enjoyed trying new restaurants. His pictures were clean-cut, suit and tie, a winning smile, the kind of guy who looked like he had his life together. We hit it off right away, chatting about everything from our favorite Netflix shows to the best pizza spots in New York. After a week of banter, he asked if I'd like to go out for dinner that Saturday. Sure, why not? I'd said. He suggested a nice Italian place I'd heard of, but never been to. It sounded perfect. Saturday night came, and I spent extra time getting ready. It wasn't every day I got to dress up and go somewhere fancy. When he pulled up outside, I grabbed my purse and headed out with high hopes. That optimism, unfortunately, lasted about 30 seconds. He was wearing sweatpants. Not even the nice, tailored kind that you can pass off as trendy, just baggy, faded gray sweats and a wrinkled t-shirt. My heart sank a little, but I told myself not to be judgmental. Maybe he was just going for a laid-back vibe. Maybe he didn't own a lot of formal clothes. I shrugged it off, trying to focus on the fact that he was here and seemed excited for our date. The car ride was awkward. He wasn't nearly as chatty as he'd been over text, and I found myself struggling to fill the silences. He didn't ask about my day, didn't compliment my dress, nothing. Still, I figured things might turn around once we got to the restaurant. When we pulled into the parking lot of the Italian place, I let out a sigh of relief. The glow of the restaurant's sign and the bustle of diners inside reassured me that this date might not be a total disaster. I reached for the car door, but he stopped me. "Wait," he said, gesturing for me to follow him. "Come here." I hesitated, confused. The entrance to the restaurant was just a few feet away. Why weren't we going inside? But I got out of the car and followed him anyway, assuming he had some sort of surprise planned. I should have trusted my instincts. He led me toward the side of the building, where a row of dumpsters loomed in the dim light. The smell hit me before we even got close. Old food, sour milk, something distinctly rotting. I stopped in my tracks, wrinkling my nose. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice laced with confusion. He grinned and pointed to the dumpsters. "Dinner's served," he said, like he'd just delivered the punchline of a great joke. I froze, staring at him as my brain tried to process what he was saying. "What?" I managed to choke out. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked up to one of the dumpsters, lifted the lid, and pulled out a takeout container. He opened it to reveal a sad-looking pile of leftover pasta. Without hesitation, he grabbed a fork from his pocket and started eating. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice climbing with disbelief. "Yeah," he said, between bites of the questionable pasta. "I do this all the time. It's a waste to let good food go uneaten." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Here I was, dressed to the nines, standing next to a man who thought rummaging through dumpsters was an acceptable first date activity. The smell alone was making my stomach turn, but the sight of him eating out of that container, cold, crusty pasta that could have been sitting there for hours, or worse, made me want to gag. "I can't do this," I said, taking a step back. "This is disgusting." He looked at me, genuinely surprised. "What's the big deal? It's perfectly good food." My mind was racing. I had no ride home, and no way to escape this absolute nightmare of a date. Desperate, I mumbled something about needing to use the bathroom and darted back toward the restaurant. When I got inside, I went straight to the host's stand, practically begging the hostess for help. "I'm on a terrible date," I whispered. "Can you please call me an Uber?" The hostess gave me a sympathetic look and nodded. While I waited for the car, I kept glancing nervously out the window, half expecting my date to come looking for me. When the Uber finally pulled up, I slipped out the back door and didn't look back. As I sat in the car, replaying the night in my head, I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. I mean, who does that? Who plans a fancy dinner date and then points to a dumpster like it's the main course? And who thinks it's okay to eat dumpster pasta in front of someone they're trying to impress? By the time I got home, I'd decided it was definitely laughable. A horrifying story, yes, but also a ridiculous one I'd be telling for years. My friends were in stitches when I called to tell them. The moral of the story? Always trust your gut. And maybe do a little extra vetting before agreeing to dinner with a stranger. Because sometimes, the guy who seems sweet and charming online turns out to be the one digging through dumpsters for date night leftovers. Sometimes, it takes running for your life to stumble into the best thing that's ever happened to you. That's not hyperbole. It's exactly what happened to me one fateful night when a Tinder date spiraled into a moment so bizarre it felt like something out of a dark comedy. Looking back, it's hilarious. At the time, though, I wasn't sure if I was more horrified or just plain confused. It started out like any other first date. I'd matched with a guy, let's call him Brian, and we'd hit it off quickly over text. He was funny, kind of charming, and seemed genuinely excited to meet in person. After a few days of chatting, he suggested drinks at a trendy bar downtown, followed by hanging out at his place nearby. It felt casual, low pressure, and perfectly normal. When I arrived at the bar, he was waiting outside, smiling. He looked just like his photos, tall, scruffy in a cute way, and dressed nicely enough to make a good first impression. The first hour went smoothly. We talked about our favorite bands, swapped travel stories, and laughed at the awkward quirks of online dating. By the time he suggested heading back to his place for a drink, I didn't hesitate. Everything seemed fine. His apartment was clean but lived in, the kind of place that screamed single guy with a decent job, but no time to decorate. We settled onto the couch with a couple of beers, and the conversation flowed easily. I was starting to relax, thinking, maybe this could turn into something. Then he excused himself. "Be right back," he said, disappearing down the hallway toward what I assumed was the bathroom. I sat there, scrolling through my phone to kill time. A few minutes passed, then a few more. I thought about calling out to him, but before I could, I heard his footsteps returning. I glanced up, and immediately froze. He was completely naked. No shirt, no pants, no socks. Just nothing. He stood there in all his glory. Looking at me like this was the most natural thing in the world. My brain short-circuited. For a split second, I thought, is this a joke? Am I being pranked? But his expression wasn't playful. It was expectant, like he thought I'd be thrilled by this sudden display of vulnerability. What are you doing?" I stammered, my voice high-pitched and shaky. He shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "I thought we could take things to the next level," he said, stepping closer. I jumped off the couch so fast I nearly tripped. "Nope," I said, grabbing my purse and backing toward the door. "Absolutely not. This is no. Just no." "Wait, what's wrong?" he asked, genuinely confused, as if I were the one acting strange. I didn't stick around to explain. I bolted out the door, sprinted down the hallway, and didn't stop until I was safely in my car with the doors locked. My hands were shaking as I texted my friend, telling her what had just happened. "You're not going home after that," she replied immediately. "Come meet me at the bar. You need a drink." She wasn't wrong. I needed a drink and about 1,000 hours of therapy to scrub the image of naked Brian from my memory. So I drove straight to the bar, still feeling a mix of shock, disgust, and disbelief. By the time I arrived, my friend was already at a booth with a margarita waiting for me. I slid into the seat, and she took one look at my face before bursting out laughing. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "Worse," I replied, taking a long sip of my drink. "I've seen everything." As I recounted the story, complete with every horrifying detail, she doubled over with laughter. "You can't make this stuff up," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Only you would have a date that ends with a guy pulling a stunt like that." Just as I was finishing the story, someone approached our table. He was tall, with dark hair and kind eyes, and he was holding 2 beers. "Hey," he said, glancing between us. "Sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. That's got to be the worst date story I've ever heard." "Oh, it's worse than it sounds," I said, laughing despite myself. He introduced himself, let's call him James, and slid into the booth next to my friend, clearly interested in hearing the rest of the story. The 3 of us spent the next hour laughing, swapping dating horror stories, and bonding over the absurdity of it all. James had an easy charm about him, the kind that instantly puts you at ease. By the time my friend excused herself to get another round, leaving the 2 of us alone, I realized I hadn't thought about naked Brian in at least 30 minutes. "So," James said, grinning at me, "does this mean you're giving up on dating apps?" "After tonight? Probably," I said, shaking my head. "I think I've hit my limit." "Well," he said, raising his beer, "here's to accidental meet cuties." I laughed and clinked my glass against his. By the time the night ended, we'd exchanged numbers, and he promised to text me the next day. True to his word, he did. And that text turned into a date, which turned into another, and another. 5 years later, we're still together. We've built a life that feels solid, happy, and full of laughter. A life I never would have found if I hadn't run screaming from Brian's apartment that night. Every now and then, James will tease me about the story that brought us together. "You should send Brian a thank you note," he'll say. He scared you right into my arms. And honestly, he's not wrong. Life has a funny way of turning disasters into blessings. Because as horrifying as that night was, it led me to the kind of love I'd been searching for all along.